and welcome. How is everybody today? Good. Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be giving the Devane lectures. And the Devane lectures, as you can tell from looking around you, double as being a regular Yale course for credit that students can take for credit, and lectures that are open to the general public. These lectures are going to deal with power and politics in today's world. And by today's world, I'm going to mean the 30 years since 1989. And the 30 years since 1989 have been an incredibly tumultuous and period of very great change. And that's very unusual. For instance, if you compare it to the previous 40 years in most of the advanced capitalist democracies, they were a period of relative stability after World War II. In most countries, it was an era of great prosperity. Even countries recovering from World War II, like the countries of Europe, were being rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid. And it was a period, partly for demographic reasons, of very great political stability for people who grew up in that period. Internationally as well, it was a period of very great stability partly because of the Cold War. It's true we had episodes like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, but as the Vietnam War indicates, most of the conflicts within the Cold War were played out, as you like, as proxy wars in other parts of the world. And so from the point of view of the citizens of the Western democracies, except for those who were actually fighting in Vietnam, it was a far-off war that didn't have a great impact on the stability of people's lives. And that is very different from what has been experienced since 1989. Time, if you like, has speeded up a great deal. We've seen incredible change in 3 decades. And those are the 3 decades that I am going to be exploring. One pedagogical challenge that presents is that for some of us in this room, the last 3 decades are etched into our minds as like it was yesterday. We experienced them in real time. But there are many people in this room who were never born until long after that. And so for them, you know, whether it's the last 40 years or the last 60 years after the 40 years or the 60 years after World War II, it's all history. And so one of the first things I need to do, and I'm going to try and make this a regular practice during the course, is I need to take everybody back and to make people understand who weren't there what it was like, and then to remind people who've lived through it of things that they might have forgotten. So let's just go back to 1989 in Berlin.
The Berlin Wall. Once it divided East from West. Now on its way to becoming an artifact of history. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting tonight from in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Germany. Good evening. These are the sights and sounds of the continuing celebration of Germans about the symbolic, not the literal, at least not yet, but the symbolic tearing down of the Berlin Wall. It's impossible to completely describe how deeply Germans feel about what's happened here. Now, East German border guards tonight were literally tearing down portions of the wall itself, not the whole wall, but portions of the wall, to make it easier for East Germans to come into West Berlin. And as the joyous hordes of Berliners were still streaming through the wall, the East German Communist government said they can come and go permanently. They can come into West Berlin, have a look, and then come back home again, with no special documents required. Today, what goes through your mind and heart?
Well, of course, I look back to all those years of hardship for the families, even more than for the country as a whole, and it's moving to see families getting together again. My feeling is that we are very close to an end of the artificial division of Berlin, and I also believe we are close to the point where the parts of Germany will become much closer together. This, of course, only within a reasonable European framework.
Anyone know who that was? Willy Brandt, the former Chancellor of Germany, who actually would die a couple of years, 3 years after that. So he was one of the celebratory crowd at that time. So that might give you a little sense of the shock and the enthusiasm that people experienced in the latter days of 1989. This had been a period in which the Soviet Union was clearly losing its grip on Eastern Europe. It wasn't just Germany. Right across Eastern Europe, all through 1989, there had been these massive resistance movements developing, and the Soviet Union was losing. It was clearly not in a position to intervene in these countries, and they were shedding totalitarian control for the first time in decades. Of course, the great exception, which we will be talking about next week, was in China, where demonstrations in Tiananmen Square that June had come out meant a very different result. But in most of the world, after 1989, it seemed like democracy was on the march. We saw the democratization of all of the former Soviet Union bloc countries in Eastern Europe, even places like South Africa, which had been mired in a bitter conflict for decades, transitioned in the early 1990s to a multiracial democracy. The problems in Northern Ireland finally settled with the Good Friday Accords in 1997. Even Israel-Palestine, which had been one of the most intractable conflicts for decades and decades, seemed to be moving towards a resolution in the early 1990s. There were the Oslo Accords. The PLO and the Israeli government were negotiating a settlement. Anyone who was in Israel or the West Bank at that time anticipated that there was going to be a settlement until the assassination of one of the key protagonists, Yitzhak Rabin, in November of 1995. But that would lead to an unraveling of that potential settlement. But in the early 1990s, it's really, I think, difficult to overstate the enthusiasm for change. This is the period when, Francis Fukuyama was talking about the end of history, by which he meant that liberal democracy was sweeping the world. In fact, at the turn of the 21st century, we finally went from a world in which most countries in the world were not democracies by most standard measures to a world in which most countries were democracies by most standard measures. So it's not surprising that one would have had the kind of enthusiasm that Fukuyama had at that time, and that was almost what's the word? Just snowballing across so much of the developed world. Enormous confidence in democratic capitalism and enormous confidence in the idea that many people were going to be lifted out of poverty and that the world was heading for a kind of benign equilibrium, as an economist would say, of Fukuyama's end of history idea. Now let's fast forward 3 decades and let's stay in Germany. And here's a very different thing to look at.
Die AfD 13.
Liebe Freunde, das ist ein großer Tag in unserer Parteiengeschichte. Wir haben es geschafft. Wir sind im Deutschen Bundestag und wir werden dieses Land verändern. Und da wir ja nun offensichtlich drittstärkste Partei sind, kann sich diese Bundesregierung, die gebildet wird, wie immer sie aussieht, sie kann sich warm anziehen. Wir werden sie jagen. Wir werden Frau Merkel oder wen auch immer jagen. Und wir werden uns unser Land und unser Volk zurückholen.
So he's a leader of the Alternative for Deutschland, far-right, anti-immigrant, anti-system political party. And what he's celebrating is that they have crossed the 5% threshold. This is the AfD here on this graph. Germany has a 5% threshold to get seats in the parliament. So if you don't get 5%, you get no seats. They hadn't gotten 5% before, and now they had won 5%. And so they saw themselves as getting a foothold in German electoral politics for the first time. And so Germany in 2017 was coming out of a situation in which there had been a grand coalition between the SPD, which is the left-of-center Social Democratic Party, and the right-of-center CDU, Christian Democrat Party, led by Angela Merkel. And the SPD were very unhappy. They had been in this grand coalition for a long time, and they found that they were paying a huge price with their supporters. They were getting less and less of the vote for reasons we'll talk about later in the course, and they announced that they were not going to participate in a grand coalition again, and they were going to go into opposition and rebuild themselves. And so Angela Merkel then spent the next 6 months the Alternative for Deutschland were and still are seen as beyond the pale. Nobody will form a government with them. So she spent the next 6 months trying to put together a coalition with the Green Environmentalist Party and the so-called Free Democrats. The Free Democrats would be what we would think of as kind of, in this country, as Rand Paul libertarians. They are for small government, low regulation, across the board. And so it's not surprising that she couldn't do it, because the Greens want green regulation, they want environmental regulation, that's their raison d'etre, and the Free Democrats want no regulation, or certainly less regulation. So they stumbled along in and out of negotiations, but they weren't able to form a coalition. However, over the course of that 6 months, all the opinion polls showed that the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, was actually rising in popularity. And so the German president was very against having another election in the face of the stalemate, with the Social Democrats refusing to join in a grand coalition on the one hand, and Merkel's inability to construct a different coalition on the other. They all knew that if they went for another election, the AfD would do even better. So finally, after much hand-wringing, the SPD was persuaded, after extracting a very big set of concessions, including 6 ministries and the finance ministry, they were persuaded to go back into a grand coalition, even though a lot of their membership didn't want it. So terrified were they of the prospect of another election in which the far right would do even better. So we thought German politics was kind of settling down at this point, but the following year, this is what you see happening.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's led Germany for 13 years, has offered to step down as her party's leader and said she won't run for office again after her term ends in 2021. Her announcement came the day after her party, the Christian Democratic Union, saw a disappointing performance in a key regional election in the state of Hesse. The far-right Alternative for Germany party claimed more than a dozen seats in Hesse's parliament for the first time. The anti-immigrant party now controls seats in all 16 of Germany's state parliaments, plus the national Bundestag and the European Parliament.
So there it is. They had also done very poorly in the Bavarian regional elections. They had hemorrhaged about 10% of their vote to the AfD in these regional elections. And by the way, the SPD wasn't very happy either because they were hemorrhaging support to the Greens. So this is something we'll see playing out in many European countries. The establishment parties are shrinking and becoming weaker, and the parties on the fringes are growing and becoming stronger. And it was impossible not to start thinking about the past and thinking particularly about the 1920s and 30s.
Ich habe mir ein Ziel gestellt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen. Sie verwechseln uns mit ihresgleichen selbst. Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verbessern es von nachher rücksichtslos dieses Grab hinein.
As a result of the elections of July 1932, the Nazis became the biggest party in Germany, with 37% of the vote.
So, you know, if you want to go back to the 1930s, you can see that video was about the July 1932 election. And you can see what happened in the subsequent elections. That it was a very unstable system. They were having multiple elections. And of course, 18 months later, Hitler came to power. And if you go to Germany, you hear very anxious people talking about, you know, is this Back to the Future? Is 2017 and 2018 some kind of replay of the empowerment of extremist parties? And of course, it wasn't just Germany. In 2016, we had massive shocks delivered to establishment parties with the Brexit result in the UK and Donald Trump's populist stampede to the presidency in the US, both widely unanticipated outcomes by most of the establishment parties, pundits, and politicians. And you could go around the world. In the Austrian elections of 2016, people were very relieved that in the runoff, the Green candidate actually defeated the far right quite handsomely by 54 to 46%. But if you look at the legislature, again, you see the far right gaining ground, the establishment parties coming in 4th and 5th in the 2017 legislative elections. These are the parties that would normally have come in 1st and 2nd, while the far right party increased its vote, putting them a close 3rd with 51 seats, while the Greens fell below the threshold and won nothing. Or if you look at Belgium, again, you see a center-right party retains its majority, but if you drill down a little bit, you can see that there was an increase of support for the far-right Flemish Vlaam Belang, which received almost 12% of the vote, gaining seats. If you look at Italy, you can see the center-left party ceding power to the center-right, but many of the votes for the center-right party are coming from the League, so-called, again, a far right-wing populist party, which ends up with 125 seats and 17% of the popular vote, a gain of 109 seats. And I could put up another 7 or 8 or 9 slides of different countries that basically tell the same stories in country after country across Europe, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, including countries that we thought of as bastions of civil social democratic stability like Sweden. You see these far-right parties doing well. Turkey, Latin America, elsewhere, where anti-establishment parties that sometimes also verge on being anti-system parties are gaining ground in many legislatures. So if you think about the contrast between the video of 1989 and where the world has been since 2016, it couldn't be more dramatic, and in some ways, it's a big downer. But my first thing I want to say is don't get too depressed. It's not all a cause for depression. The central questions of this course are 3. How did we get from there to here? What are the challenges and prospects going forward? And most importantly, in the last part of the course, how could we get to a better place in many of the countries that we're talking about? We'll spend a lot of time on the US, but not exclusively in the US. I should say a little bit about the distinctive approach that I'm going to be taking in these lectures. Not to say it's the best approach. There are many ways to look at this kind of material, but it is the approach that I'm going to be using. And the first thing I would say about this approach is that I'm going to be studying history with the tools of political science and political theory on the one hand, but also using history to keep political science and political theory honest. So what do I mean by that? Well, one thing that is remarkable about the events of 1989 is that they supply us with a kind of terrific natural experiment from the point of view of social scientists. If you look at the literature, for example, of people who studied European democracies before 1989, they were essentially cycling endless numbers of theories through the same old data set that everybody had had for decades. And they didn't have a big exogenous change. 1989 is a big shock to the system, and suddenly we have, for instance, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, the addition of a whole lot of new parliamentary democracies. And so that creates possibilities of thinking about long-established conventional wisdom, testing theories that against new data, which is the gold standard for social science, rather than testing theories on data out of which the theories had been developed, which tend to result in what statisticians call just so stories, sort of fitting the curve to the data. Suddenly we have all this new data coming along in real time. And so if you think about, and we're going to talk some about some of the standard theories in political science, like modernization theory, which is a theory about how as economies modify, certain kinds of political changes become more likely. There was long held that modernization produces democracy. There were many variants of modernization theory, and we will talk about some of the differences among them. But now we have new data on whether modernizing economies will produce democracy. It has long been conventional wisdom that democratic systems are incompatible with state-run economies. If we look at what's happened since 1989, we've gone to market economies in some of the post-communist systems, but others, like China and Vietnam, have become state capitalist systems of a certain kind while retaining non-democratic politics. So we'll have cause to think about theories of that general sort. There's been a lot of conventional wisdom about the conditions for stable democracy that suddenly can be put to the test on a whole slew of new democracies. Is it all the economy stupid? Or do beliefs of citizens matter? And what kinds of beliefs matter? And what about the beliefs of elites? All of these things we can look at, again, in new contexts. So we have lots of new data to think about them, provided by this dramatic break of 1989. There's a lot of conventional wisdom about the relations between business, government, and labor that has built up among political economists and political scientists over the last several decades before 1989. Again, we now have big power shifts, partly because communism as an economic system has been taken off the table. Well, if communism as an economic system is taken off the table, how does that restructure relations between business, government, and labor? It turns out it really has a big impact on those relationships. So that's another of the topics we will be looking at. How do electoral systems affect things like inequality, provision of environmental legislation and public goods? A lot of conventional wisdom there about which types of democracies are more likely to do that and which are less likely to do that. Start to look before and after 1989, and we're going to discover that some of the conventional wisdom needs rethinking. So on the one hand, we're bringing the tools of political science and the theories of political science to bear on the data that's thrown up by this last 30 years of history. On the other hand, we're using that data to keep the political scientists honest, precisely because we have this whole smorgasbord of new results, as a social scientist would put it. But then I also said I'm going to use the tools of political theory. So political theory, I should confess, truth in advertising, my first profession, to the extent it is a profession, is I'm a political theorist. I cut my teeth in the world of political philosophy, in normative things about what should happen, how the world should be organized, rather than empirical work on how it is organized. And so we are definitely going to be thinking about normative questions here as well as we go along. What should happen? What might have happened? But the confession I need to make about my home discipline is that it reminds me of the story about the fellow who goes up to a farmer in Donegal and says, "How do I get to Dublin?" And the answer that comes back is, "Well, I wouldn't start from here, sonny." That is to say, much of political philosophy develops theories that take no account of where we actually are and how the theories that people argue about in the journals and in the literature actually could be implemented in the world, if at all. And this spills over into normative arguments made by other scholars. Thomas Piketty, in his book capital in the 21st century, argues for a 4% global wealth tax. Well, good luck with that. Who's going to implement a 4% global wealth tax? So when I think about normative questions, it's going to be from the perspective of how might the goals that we think are desirable actually be achieved. And so I am going to spend, as we go along through this, the different topics that we're going to be discussing, I am going to be focusing on paths not taken, things that might have been done differently. And here, the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about are things like NATO expansion. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the NATO alliance, we'll talk about this next week, was expanded over the next several decades to include eventually all of the former Soviet bloc countries, and there were overtures also to including former Soviet states like Georgia and several others. I'll talk about this. Ukraine. Georgia and Ukraine were both talking about joining NATO. That's part of the reason the Soviet Union invaded Ukraine. So we will talk about whether there was a path not taken at that time. French President Francois Mitterrand thought that NATO should be shut down at the end of the Cold War. It was a defensive alliance that had lost its purpose. How realistic was that? How might the world have been different had that happened? We're going to be talking about the global war on terror, ushered in after 9/11, when we invaded first Afghanistan and then Iraq. Was there another path that would have been politically viable, that would have led the world in a different direction? We will talk about the response to the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Again, were there possibilities that were ignored or overlooked that might have been both politically feasible and more effective in the sense of policy? And so that brings me to underscore the third feature of the approach that I am going to take in this course, which is when you look at people who talk about public policy, it tends either to be policy wonks who just go on about what would be the best policy, or political scientists who talk about why some policies get adopted in some systems and not in other systems. But there's very little discussion of what is the effective political way of achieving a good policy, or the effective political way of blocking a bad policy. And so when I talk about innovations in the last part of the course, it's very much going to be in a way that marries considerations of politics to considerations of good public policy. So that is the flavor of what we're going to be doing here. And as I said, it's not the only way one might study these materials, but it's the way that we're going to be doing it in this course. Let me talk a little bit about the shape of the course. It falls into 5 sections. The first one is going to, starting on Monday, deal with the collapse of communism and its aftermath. There we're going to look at collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in China, and in Vietnam, although I will talk about some other countries along the way. We're going to talk about the rise of a unipolar world. Until 1989, we had a bipolar world in which there was, as I said, a lot of actual stability that came about as a byproduct of the Cold War, at least among the major powers, even if they maintained their stability partly by acting out their conflicts in proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But by and large, the great powers were, the nuclear standoff worked, and we didn't have a major conflict between them. Now we have gone to a unipolar world dominated by a single power after 1989. How does that restructure politics and the possibilities for politics? That will be also part of our concern. And then I'm going to talk about the politics of the economics, what I'm going to call the rise of neoliberalism at home and the Washington consensus abroad. And this is basically, it comes to exist because of the collapse of an alternative to capitalism, the disappearance of communism as a viable political system, as a viable economic system. And so you have this idea that's often called neoliberalism that basically has 3 elements. It's trade deregulation, trade deals, getting rid of restraints on trade, getting rid of internal regulation within countries, and massive privatization of formerly state assets. That was called the neoliberal approach to public political economy. And when it's translated into a set of recommendations or requirements for countries in the developing world, it was called the Washington Consensus. It was essentially adopted by the World Bank, by the IMF, as a condition for giving loans to developing countries, and it was essentially taking neoliberalism global. And so the post-communist era is marked by this massive confidence in the capacity capacity of unregulated or mildly regulated free market capitalism to deliver the best results for every country in the world. Then we're going to talk about the new global order that is ushered in by this. We're going to look at whether democracy really was on the march. The people thought about a potential. We had talked, again, the conventional wisdom in political science was that the democratization had proceeded in 3 waves. The first wave being the gradual expansion of the franchise in what we think of today as the older democracies. The second wave being decolonization in Africa and Asia and Latin America after World War II. The third wave coming in 1989 to 1991, and people started to wonder whether there's a fourth wave now with the democratization of South Africa, with settlements in places like Northern Ireland, initially with the Arab Spring. People wondered whether we were going to start to see more democracy as part of this new global order. Then we're going to look at the international institutions that developed in this global order. We'll talk about things like the International Criminal Court, which for the first time would hold dictators to account for their activities of repression. There was the creation of something called a doctrine at the United Nations called the responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect says that this was in the wake of things like the Rwanda genocide of 1994 and what happened in Kosovo in 1999. Eventually we got responsibility to protect, where the UN was said all governments are going to be held accountable for severe human rights violations within their own territories. And if they don't respect them, the UN is going to intervene militarily. This is, a big change. We're saying we're not going to respect the absolute sovereignty of nations. So the new international order seems to be affecting not only relations among countries, but relations within them. The third part of the course I'm calling the end of history, and this is really has its ultimate roots with 9/11 and the emergence of the global war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and eventually the collapse in Syria. We're going to see that the idea that history was heading in some benign direction was getting harder and harder for people to hold onto. We're going to look at the resurgence of state capitalism. We're going to look at what China has been and is doing in Africa. We are going to be looking at Russia's resurgence as a global power. They had been back on their heels for much of the 1990s and early 2000s, but now they became actively involved in the Middle East and elsewhere. We're going to look at the new role of business in many political conflicts around the world, sometimes with benign purposes in mind, but often not. And so we're going to start to see a much messier politics. The fourth part of the course is about the new politics of insecurity. This is really ushered in not so much by the financial crisis itself, but by the way in which governments responded to the financial crisis. And this will be one of the areas where we will be looking at paths not taken, but we will see that there was growing insecurity in the workforces of many of the advanced democracies that had been building up for decades. And the financial crisis threw into sharp relief the fact that most governments were not doing much about it, if anything at all. And in fact, that they ended up bailing out the elites while doing nothing much for the people who have been most harmed in the crisis. And so we will look at the response to the financial crisis in a number of countries, particularly in the US. And then we will, in the last part of the course, what is to be done, that great Leninist slogan, we will be looking at two things, really. First, how the voter sentiment in these countries was so poorly misdiagnosed by so many political elites and people in control of political parties. Misdiagnosed to the point where not only did they fail to respond to the growing economic insecurity that was being experienced by many, many millions of workers within their own countries, they were actually implementing political reforms that were likely to make things worse. And so the last part of the course will be looking at those two interacting issues. What sorts of economic policies were pursued or failed to be pursued, what kinds of policies might have been pursued, and how did the reform of political systems over the last 15 or 20 years make the problem worse. And that will lead me to make some arguments about how we should think about politics going forward. So that is what we're going to be doing. It's a big menu. We have 26, now soon to be 25 lectures in which to explore it. I'm going to before breaking today, I'm going to talk about a few logistical matters. One is that I have been asked to announce, but you can see for yourself, that the Office of Public Affairs is taking pictures, and these lectures are going to be videotaped. And this will include, we will have microphones so we can have questions from the floor and interaction. But you should know that this is all being tape recorded, and so anything you say can be taken down and used in evidence against you. So a couple of other logistical things. One is I want to introduce Christina Seyfried. Christina, she's the head teaching fellow for the course. She will be overseeing the grading of students who are taking the course for credit. And she will also be working with me in running office hours for people from the community, which we're both going to be doing. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But you will see more of Christina as we go along. Office hours. I'm going to be having office hours in Rosencrantz room 201 from 10 to 12 on Wednesdays and Fridays. The presumption there is that from 10 to 12, Yale students have priority. These are walk-in office hours, not by appointment. And on 10 to 12 on Fridays, people from the community have priority. But who knows who will, if anyone will show up. But that's the way it'll work. 201 Rosencrantz Hall, which is right opposite the new colleges up the street. Christina is going to have office hours for people from the community on Thursdays from 5 to 7 at a place yet to be announced. And one thing we're going to do, the office hours are not just going to vanish into the ether. Christina and I are going to film 5 sessions over the course of the semester where she and I will discuss what's come up in the office hours, and we will post that on the course website. I do this with my Coursera course, and it proves to be quite helpful. So we will get questions that have come up in the office hours, both in our office hours and in office hours between the students and the teaching fellows, that they will be participating as well, and we will publish those videos of the office hours on the course website. Access to reading. Anyone who has a Yale ID can get almost all of the readings on Canvas. There's a few, I think 3 of the books we're using too much for copyright reasons to put them on Canvas, but they're all in the library for anyone who doesn't want to buy any. The people from the community we have made available in the New Haven Public Library, if you don't have access to Canvas, a couple of sets of the books that we're using in the course, so you can get them that way. The students who are taking the course for credit, the official exam is the last afternoon of the last day of exams, which I'm sure some of you have already bought plane tickets that are inconsistent with that. So actually we're going to have 2 alternate exams, one on December 11th, and this is primarily to accommodate SOM students because of the timing of the SOM elective exam period. And that exam will, if we can arrange it, be held at SOM. And then there'll be, but others can take it then as well if they want. And then there'll be another alternate exam on Friday the 13th. So there'll be different times at which people can take the exam. Policy here will be no laptops, no screens, no iPhones. I came to this policy a couple of years ago. It definitely works better. It's just too tempting to be doing that Amazon shopping for your grandmother's birthday present that you forgot about. And it's very distracting, not only for the people around you, but it's also distracting for me to teach. We will post the slides on Canvas and on the course webpage after the lectures, so people will have access to the slides. What you'll find is if you go and you look at the slides on Canvas, they'll look like they've been turned into a PDF, and the video will not play. If you want to play the video, you have to download the slides, and then it will regurgitate as playable video. So it is possible to play the video. Yeah, so no laptops, no screens, no phones, and everything I put up here will be available to you, so you don't have to take copious notes of what appears on slides. Comments, questions? Yes, sir, you're going to have to yell. We will have microphones here starting next time.
If you're a participant from the community, how can you log on to Canvas?
You can't. So that's why we put a set of the readings in the New Haven Library. The reason for it, it's not just Yale being mean. It turns out there are 2 sets of copyright rules. So if you're photocopying chapters from a book, you're allowed to take up to 10% of the book. Otherwise, you have to buy the book if you're using it. But universities for their students have a more permissive rule. So we can take more than 10% from a book. I've forgotten what the exact number is, but it's much more than 10%. We can take more than 10% from a book and put it up on Canvas if it's only available to Yale students. But if we made them available to the general public, Yale would be violating copyright laws. So that's why we have bought 2 complete sets of the books and put them in the New Haven Public Library, from which we have been Xeroxing most of this stuff. So you should be able to get the vast majority of the readings if you want to go down there and get them. Other questions, comments, observations? If there's a question in your mind, it's probably in the mind of 30 other people, so they'll be grateful if you ask it. Yeah, you just have to yell. Are we going to look at the European Union as well as what?
As well as, its current form and what other forms it may have seen by the course and like that, definitely look at as well.
We're certainly going to look at the growth of the European Union and the expansion of the European Union since, in fact, we're going to talk about it next class. We're going to look at the expansion of the European Union since the Cold War. I'll talk very briefly about the early, but this course is really post-1989. It is not, we've just hired David Eggerman and Arnie Vestad, who are both Cold War historians, who are going to be teaching courses on the Cold War. So if you really want to deal with the post-war Europe from, or interwar Europe to the end of the Cold War, these are the guys who are going to be teaching that stuff going forward in Yale College. So I'm very consciously not doing that. I will talk about the way in which the European Union was formed, which has had a lot to do with its current troubles, but mostly I'm going to focus on since 1989. Yeah? Pardon? There are no sections in this course. This is why we have an hour and a quarter lecture rather than a 50-minute lecture. Yeah?
What are the topics for the 2 papers?
The topics for the papers will be posted 2 weeks before the papers are due, and we will give I should say a couple of things about that. This is not a research course, so you can write a first-rate paper based on reading the material on this syllabus. You're not expected to go beyond the syllabus. And we will post 2 weeks before the papers are due a list of topics and it will be there will be very significant amount of choice on it. So we'll probably give you 4 or 5 possible topics to write about. Yes, sir. What is the expectation for graduate students? The same course requirements, 2 papers and a final exam. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is there a limit for students to join the class?
Pardon?
Is there a limit for students to join the class?
No, there's no limit. This is an uncapped course. I'm hoping we can stay in this room. It looks like it. Numbers tend to go down rather than up during shopping period. No, it's not a capped course. Yeah.
In terms of interactions, will those be towards the end of the lecture?
Well,
Questions, will that be at the end of the lecture?
People have taken courses with me before know that I have a pretty interactive lecturing style. So yes, there will be microphones and there will be questions. I'm not planning to talk for an hour and a quarter every Tuesday and Thursday. So there will be significant amount of interaction. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, we currently, I believe, have 6, in addition to Christina's teaching fellows, all of whom will be holding office hours. And so they'll be available, and you will be able to go and talk to them about what's come up in the class, about your papers, and so on. And the conversations you have with those teaching fellows, we will also address then in the videotaped office hours that we post. Okay. So, any other questions, comments, reactions? So, on Tuesday, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union from Soviet communism to Russian gangster capitalism. I will see you then. Again, both taking some people down memory lane and recreating where we're coming from for those who are too young to have experienced it. Let's go back to August 19 of 1991 in Moscow.
Mingling with the rush hour traffic, Red Army armored personnel carriers on the streets of Moscow this morning, heading to the Kremlin. They first moved in at 4 a.m., the first sign of the coup d'etat that removed Mikhail Gorbachev from power. With tanks in Red Square, the official word from the new government, calling itself the National Emergency Committee, was that the architect of glasnost and perestroika was too ill to continue in office. A short statement reminiscent of the Soviet Union's past was broadcast by state television. vision.
В связи с невозможностью по состоянию здоровья исполнения Горбачевым Михаилом Сергеевичем своих обязанностей президента СССР на основании статьи 127 пункт 7 Конституции СССР вступил в исполнение обязанностей президента СССР с 19 августа 1991 года вице-президент СССР Янаев.
By mid-morning, APCs were ringing the Defense Ministry and most government buildings. From many people on the streets, the reaction was one of sheer surprise and resignation.
So that was a pretty dramatic moment in August of 1991. And the coup, of course, was being prosecuted against Mikhail Gorbachev, who had come to power as the head of the Soviet Union in 1985. Leonid Brezhnev had been General Secretary of the Communist Party for a number of decades after Khrushchev, but he died in 1982, and it was an aging Politburo, and he was replaced in quick succession by two transitional figures, one of whom died after 14 months and the other who died after 11 months. And so when Gorbachev came to power in February of 1985, there was a lot of head-scratching going on in the West as to what would become of the Soviet Union. And he rapidly transfixed people both at home in Russia, as the Soviet Union as it then was, and abroad. He seemed to be a different kind of politician. He was extremely charismatic. He was much younger. He could talk and behave like a Western politician, and he quickly went on a kind of charm offensive around the world. He developed a strong rapport with Ronald Reagan, which led to arms reduction talks in Reykjavik, and he began the processes of what he called perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika is Russian for restructuring, and he planned fundamental restructuring of the Soviet economy. He had become convinced that the old command system didn't work and had to be reformed. Glasnost was basically free speech, that they began opening up the state-controlled media. They started creating much more access to different media outlets. They allowed criticism of the regime that had been unthinkable until that time, and it seemed like the Soviet Union was really beginning to change. And then, of course, in 1989, when the revolutions happened across Eastern Europe that I talked about last time, the Soviet Union did nothing. They didn't intervene as they had previously intervened in Hungary. They did not do anything to stop the departure of the East European countries from the Soviet bloc and the transitions that were by then would soon be getting underway. And Gorbachev was seen as this radical reformer. He was a reformer. He was not a revolutionary. And he thought that he could adjust the Soviet system in a gradual way to some new order. But as he did that, of course, he ran into a lot of pushback from vested interests, from communist ideologues who didn't want change. And he was fighting a battle both against them and, as we'll see in a moment, against reformers who thought that he was going too slowly. In any event, in the summer of 1991, the hardliners clearly had the upper hand, and they locked him up in his dacha on the evening of August 18th, and that was the coup that appeared to be well underway by the next day. But things were not so simple, and history was going to play out a little differently. So this is what happened a few minutes later.
Tanks were also positioned outside the Russian Parliament building, Boris Yeltsin's headquarters. The democratically elected president of Russia was soon striding out of the building to address a crowd of supporters. His own radio and television stations by now occupied and forced off the air, he climbed aboard one of the Red Army's own tanks and said the coup leaders had disgraced the Soviet Union.
Они дискредитируют Союз перед всем миром, подрывая наш престиж в мировом сообществе, возвращает нас к эпохе холодной войны и изоляции Советского Союза от мирового сообщества. Все это заставляет нас объявить незаконным пришедший к власти так называемый комитет. Соответственно, объявляем незаконными все решения и распоряжения этого комитета.
And he went further, calling for civic resistance to the hardline grab of power.
Обращаемся к военнослужащим с призывом проявить высокую гражданственность и не принимать участие в реакционном перевороте. До выполнения этих требований призываем к всеобщей бессрочной забастовке.
Yeltsin supporters reacted with their bare hands, building makeshift barricades with whatever piece of disused machinery or brickwork was available. And one crane driver joined the effort, shifting concrete blocks to the delight of the crowd, helping build the obstacles designed to prevent any army attempt to seize a Russian parliament building. No attempt was made. One army commander loyal to Boris Yeltsin, Colonel Konstantin Kobyets, tried to reassure the crowd.
Что все, кто носит военную форму, у которых бьется нормальное, честное сердце гражданина России, никогда не позволит того, чтобы армия выступила против своего народа.
And that, of course, was a decisive moment because it indicated that the military was not supporting the coup, and that instead they were going to be loyal to Boris Yeltsin. Now, Yeltsin had himself been a traditional Soviet politician in the 1970s and 1980s, and had initially been a supporter of Gorbachev's reforms. But he actually was on the more radical side of the Communist Party, at least at that time, in thinking that the reforms had to go faster and had to be more extensive. And he, in fact, got so frustrated that he did something that, at that time, in 1987, was unprecedented in the history of the Soviet Union. He resigned from the Politburo of the Communist Party. And nobody had ever done that before. There was consternation, and it was sort of covered up in that, in the end, Gorbachev fired him. And there was then some pretty significant conflict between them. And it is said that in the midst of all of this, Yeltsin actually tried to commit suicide at one point. And in any event, he left the Communist Party and started to reconstitute himself as a Russian politician, and eventually would run for to be a member of the Russian parliament. So he had done that. In fact, in June of 1991, so we're talking about 3 months before the coup attempt, he had been elected president of the Russian parliament. Where they were in this video outside the White House, that was the building of the Russian parliament, as distinct from the Soviet government buildings, which we all know about, the Kremlin, opposite Red Square. And so it was Yeltsin who stood up and faced down the coup plotters while Gorbachev was in his dacha locked up on the Black Sea. And then the military decided to get behind him, and the next day you can see Gorbachev returning.
A president returns to power. Mikhail Gorbachev flying into Moscow after being detained for 3 days on the orders of some of the men he appointed to senior positions within his own government. Their attempted coup d'etat crushed, he said tonight it was business as usual at the Kremlin, and despite the treachery of many of its senior figures, he wouldn't be leaving the Communist Party.
Я вижу свой долг, до конца буду делать, пока это в моих силах, для того, чтобы сдержать, всячески воспрепятствовать, более того, избавиться, изгнать из КПСС реакционной силы. Мы должны все сделать для того, чтобы реформировалась партия и стала живой силой.
Gorbachev said tonight he made mistakes by putting his trust in men who would try to topple him. Many here now believe he's making another mistake by staying within a communist party that's so widely discredited after the events of this week. For World Monitor, I'm Simon Marks in Moscow.
So this was, in fact, the moment when the real power passed from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, as you'll see in a minute, because Gorbachev couldn't detach himself from the idea that there had to be a gradual guided transition under the auspices of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And Yeltsin seized the moment, and this is how it played out.
The president gets the cheers summoned. He used the occasion to call for increased power for the Russian government and thanked his people for staying loyal.
Приношу глубокую благодарность тысячам военнослужащих, работникам правоохранительных органов, органов безопасности, истинным патриотам России, которые пришли к ней в помощь в роковые часы.
Present at the rally, many of the men who once served with Mikhail Gorbachev, economic advisor Stanislav Shatalin, and former foreign minister Eduard Shevardnadze, the men who helped mold Glasnost, now siding with the man of the hour. The mayor of Moscow, Gavril Popov, said to regain the support of the Democrats, Gorbachev had to break with the Communist Party and recognize its 7 decades in power were at an end. Joining the celebrations, Gorbachev's former press spokesman, Sergei Grigoriev, and his wife. After 3 nights on the barricades, he says his old boss faces a fight to take the political high ground.
But I think that he will have to define his attitude and to elaborate his position very quickly. Otherwise, his days in power might be counted. You can see, judging by the rally and by the attitude of the people, that the democratic movement is actually gaining strength.
At the end of the rally, the Russian flag was hoisted above the parliament building in place of the hammer and sickle. Ships on the river Moskva blew an audible salute. Within an hour, the crowd was heading to the seat of Soviet power, Red Square and the Kremlin. A tide of people bringing with them the banner of independence, a huge Russian flag, and shouts of down with the Communist Party. The young guards on duty at Lenin's mausoleum looked as if they were about to be mobbed. When the time came to change the guard, the normally solemn ceremony was derided by the crowd. A communist shrine now openly mocked. From Red Square, they moved on. Next stop, KGB headquarters and the statue in front of it of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the man who founded the secret police here in the 1920s. Yeltsin's spokesman promised them a crane would be brought in to bring the monument to the ground. Former Gorbachev supporters say the Russian president now has a better feel for popular sentiment than the leader in the Kremlin.
I think that with his democratic instincts and his feel what the people want and what the people need, he's really turning himself into man number one in the Soviet Union in terms of popularity and in terms of appeal to the mass.
So that was the dramatic 4 days that were really the denouement of the old Soviet order. Today, our agenda is going to be fivefold. We're going to talk about why the Soviet Union collapsed, but only somewhat briefly. We're then going to talk about the more interesting puzzle, which is why it collapsed so peacefully. Why basically one of the two superpowers in the world folded up and just died. We're then going to focus on the rise of gangster capitalism, the title of today's lecture. We're going to turn to the transition from Yeltsin, who governed throughout the 1990s. He gave up power to his hand-picked deputy, Putin, on the first day of the new millennium. He resigned effectively December 31st, 1999, and Vladimir Putin has been in control of Russia in one role or another ever since. And then lastly, we're going to focus on the question, why is Russia so corrupt, and what lessons can we draw from the fact of its corruption? So that's what we'll do. Just to review the events that led up to those 4 days in August. In May 12th, the Baltic states, echoing an old agreement from 1934, having watched 6 months earlier the war come down in Germany, signed an entente that indicated they were planning to secede from the Soviet Union. In June of that year, the Congress of People's Deputies in Russia, that is where Yeltsin would run initially as a deputy and then become president, declared that it was sovereign over Russia's territory. In March of 1991, a referendum was held on whether or not to keep the Soviet Union together. And there was high turnout and a strong majority saying yes, although there were boycotts from the Baltics and 4 or 5 other Soviet republics that didn't participate in the referendum. June of that year, exactly a year after the Russian Parliament, Congress of People's Deputies, had declared itself sovereign, Boris Yeltsin had been elected as its president. We then had the 4-day attempted coup in August, as we've just witnessed. In the midst of that coup, I should say, the day before it was finally over, Estonia and Latvia had already declared their independence. The coup was then defeated. Ukraine held a referendum and voted to secede. And then Yeltsin met with the Ukrainian president secretly and agreed that the Soviet Union no longer existed. Gorbachev was still chasing the horse out of the barn that had long since left him behind. He declared the agreement illegal and dangerous. But in December, leaders of the 11 remaining republics met in Alma-Ata, now known as Almaty, in Kazakhstan, to essentially declare the Soviet Union dead and constitute the CIS, the Confederation of Independent States. At that point, Gorbachev realized he had no choice, and he resigned on what we think of as Christmas Day, but not Christmas Day in Russia, which comes later. And at the end of the month, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So why did the Soviet Union collapse? Any thoughts? What's the first thing that comes to somebody's mind when we ask, why did the Soviet Union collapse?
Arms race.
There was an arms race, and why would that have? We'd had plenty of arms races. We had arms races all through the Cold War, so it certainly contributed, but why else? Yeah.
My parents remember how they were waiting to buy sausages, like in the market. You couldn't buy jeans.
The shops were empty. You couldn't buy anything, right? You couldn't buy anything. The GOM department store in Moscow, which is the biggest department store right off Red Square, sort of 6 or 7 story apartment store, was empty. There was nothing in it. You could buy things. There was a black market. You could buy things to some extent on the black market, but there's a hugely inefficient command system that had basically ceased to function. And the Soviet Union was dependent on this system, but the great difficulty with the command economy, and we'll talk about this more next week in relation to some of the other former communist systems, is that the people making the decisions have very bad access to reliable information. Prices are set by decree, not in response to supply and demand. There are very poor incentives to work, and so the unsustainable economy had become steadily more unsustainable. So that's one part of it, but then I want to come back to the gentleman who mentioned the arms race. The other reason is that containment worked. Now, containment had been the policy dreamed up by George Kennan, who had been a U.S. ambassador to Russia and eventually became the first head of the policy planning staff. It was an office that was created for him in the Truman administration. And he was one of the first people, this is in the 1940s, he'd been one of the first people to say the Soviet system is unsustainable. It's got a dysfunctional economy at home, and its international ambitions are such that it's going to pursue foreign adventures eventually it's not going to be able to finance. And so all we have to do is contain it. We don't need to go to war with them. We just have to contain them, prevent their expansion, and wait. There were various disagreements about what containment meant. We'll talk next week. For instance, he was opposed to forming NATO even, which he thought would unnecessarily militarize the conflict with the Soviet Union, and eventually he resigned from the government and went off in a huff to Princeton. But very largely, the US in Europe did follow the policy of containment. What changed in the 1980s was two things which increased the fiscal pressure on the already highly pressured Soviet system. One was that they got involved in a quagmire war in Afghanistan. They invaded Afghanistan in 1979, having failed to learn from the examples of the British and others who had tried to invade Afghanistan in the past. A very difficult country to invade given the terrain. And they spent the entire 1980s embroiled in this war in Afghanistan. It was their fear of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, which they thought would infect the other would start to infect the Asiatic republics of the Soviet Union, and so they were very nervous about it. And it was a huge fiscal drain, a failed war. It was the Soviet Union's version of our Vietnam War. And then secondly, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he announced Star Wars, which increased the cost of the arms race to the Soviets by an enormous amount. So these were the reasons why the Soviet Union eventually just creaked and fell apart. We could spend the entire lecture unpacking them, but this is not a course about the Cold War. What I want to put our attention on is, why was the collapse so peaceful? You would think if somebody shoots an elephant, it's going to stumble around and do an awful lot of damage before it finally collapses. This elephant basically just knelt down and died. And that's quite remarkable. Any thoughts or intuitions about why it ended with a whimper rather than a bang? Yeah?
There was a sense of desperation throughout the entire population, whether it was waiting in line for any store, any product, or being overly bunched up in housing. The lack of jobs and the lack of innovation made people very desperate and depressed.
People were desperate and afraid, but my real question is about the elites. Why did the elites give up power that they had guarded so jealously for such a long time? And after all, there are many authoritarian systems in the world where there are angry, desperate populations, and the elite clings to power and just becomes more and more repressive. Yeah?
I think they prepared themselves for this. Having looked at what happened in Berlin, they already started making sure that if this came, that they're just be protected.
Who would be protected?
The elites.
Okay, that's part of it. So the elites, just to repeat the comment in case some didn't hear it, the elites were looking for and seem to have found ways to protect themselves through the collapse. So what I'm going to do here is introduce an analytical schema from the social sciences. This is actually from a famous economist, a development economist by the name of Albert Hirschman, who published this book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in 1970. And he developed a framework for thinking about what happens when, as you can tell from the subtitle, firms, organizations, states decline. How do people respond to decline? And the framework he developed, I think this is, if you read no other book in the social sciences before you graduate, or this is certainly one of the 2 or 3 books you should definitely read. And we will use Hirschman's framework at various points in the course. And so he said, well, if you think about yourself in a declining organization, there are 3 things you can do. 1 is you can leave, exit. 2 is you can complain and try and get it changed, voice. 3, you can try to fix it yourself. You believe in the cause and you want to make it better. And a lot of Hirschman's analysis says that what mix of exit, voice, and loyalty people engage in is determined by the costs of those things. So for instance, if you think about a public company, if you're a shareholder in a public company and you don't like the way it's being run, you can just sell your shares and buy shares in a different company that you like better, right? So you don't have much incentive to go to shareholders meetings and trying to get the company, you maybe think it's got too much debt or something. You just buy shares in a company that has less debt. That's all you need to do, just exit. Very low cost of exit. So people are not going to engage in voice. Now, of course, you might care about the company. It might be ostensibly a green company, and you might be holding the shares in the company because of your commitment to green energy. Then you might feel loyalty to the company, and you will want to try and get it changed. Think about yourself as a worker working for a company. If you don't like the way the company is being run, unlike a shareholder, you can't just pick up and leave. You live in this town, you've got your family, your kids are in the schools, and so forth. The cost of exit for you are very high. So you're more likely to engage in voice. You're going to go to meetings. You're going to complain. You might form a union. You're going to do things, or join a union. You're going to do things to get the company to change its ways. So his book is an analysis of the ways in which exit, voice, and loyalty might be complementary in some circumstances and might be competitors in some circumstances for the ways in which people respond to the decline of organizations. So the first thing to say about the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s is there was a substantial decline, almost disappearance of loyalty among both the elites and the citizens. And I got a first-hand view of this. In March of 1991, there was a Yale delegate invited by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to a conference in Moscow, actually at the week before the referendum that I mentioned to you earlier. And we had been impressed by Gorbachev and so forth, but we didn't really have much knowledge about, I certainly was no expert on the Soviet Union, and most of the other people in the delegation were not. And we had this stereotypical picture of the KGB shadowing us around and telling us what to do, and we needed to be careful and so on. And the first thing we noticed was widespread evidence of brazen corruption. I'll give you just two examples. We were all afraid of what the KGB people might be doing to us. The first KGB person I ran into was trying to sell me currency at black market exchange rates. And then secondly, I went to a reception, and somebody came up to me with a translator, and the translator said, this gentleman wants to speak to you. And he said, Professor Shapiro, I understand you are South African. This is 1991. Okay, it's before the collapse of apartheid. It's the beginning of the collapse of apartheid in South Africa. Mandela is being released from prison and so forth. But the apartheid regime was still there, and it was not clear how it was going to play out. And so this person speaks in Russian, which I speak a little bit now, but I spoke none then. And basically the translator says, this gentleman wants to know how to if you can facilitate this making a connection with the government of South Africa, because he has access to weapons which he would like to sell to them. And we regard apartheid as a domestic matter. We don't care what's going on in the country, but I can sell all kinds of weapons, including nuclear weapons, which might have been nonsense, but this is quite, this actually South Africa is one of the few countries that had actually given up its nuclear arsenal as that's another story which we'll get to later. But so I was stunned by this, and I said, I think maybe you mistranslated what he was saying to me. Could you ask him to say it again? And he said it again, exactly the same thing. And so I said, very nice to meet you, goodbye. But so this was the levels of brazen. Nobody was trying to hide what they were doing. It was completely public. This is in March of 1991. We then had a meeting with Vadim Zagladin, a Politburo member, and he was at that time essentially the Secretary of State for Europe. And he gave a speech, and he said, we have concluded that the Soviet system is unsustainable. It's got to be replaced from top to bottom. And we were stunned by this. And that a leading official in the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was essentially saying the system is bankrupt. And then he gave a speech, and we went around the room, and it was clear it was a kind of situation where you're only going to get one question, so you better think about what the right question is. So when it came to my term, I said, Mr. Zagladin, when did you conclude that the Soviet Union was unsustainable? And he didn't blink. He said, 1978. He said, I was in the Young Communist League, actually with Gorbachev, and there was a whole cohort of us who concluded that the Soviet Union was unsustainable. So here you had a country led by a cadre of elites who didn't believe in the public ideology of the country. And so, of course, they had no loyalty to the public ideology of the country. It simply had dissipated. And then some of our hosts invited us to meet with various more radical factions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who were more like activists and so on. And by then, we'd been there for about a week, and we thought, we were getting some grip on this situation. So I met with this group of the members of the Communist Party, political activists, and I had the temerity to say, well, wouldn't it maybe be a good idea to transform this economy in an ordered and gradual fashion? And they started screaming at me, calling me a Stalinist and a reactionary, and so it was these are just three pieces of evidence, but everywhere you went, there was nobody who was defending the idea that, whatever nobody had the sort of attitude that Gorbachev was expressing in that final video where he said, I'm a loyal member of the Communist Party and we have to fix it, even though it had turned on him. So in terms of loyalty, Hirschman's category of loyalty, by 1991, loyalty was pretty thin on the ground. But let's think about exit. Exit, in some ways, turns out to be even more interesting. So, as I said, with the example of a company you don't like, you can just sell the stock. If the costs of exit are low and you don't have any loyalty, why waste your time trying to change an organization? And so, what was it that reduced the costs of exit? So there was some fortuitous political things. So if you think about, I already mentioned, Boris Yeltsin had been a member of the Soviet hierarchy for much of his career, but he had the opportunity to go off and be in the Russian Federation and eventually become president of the Russian Federation. Edward Shevardnadze, who had been the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, could go off and become president of Georgia, which he did. So there were places for these people to go. These, of course, are the high visibility people, but many of the lower visibility people in their entourages and so on could go with them. So there were opportunities for political exit for the leading figures and subordinate figures in many of the figures of the Soviet hierarchy. But what I want to spend more time is that the economic costs of giving up, had reduced, had come down. And this leads us into the discussion of the rise of the oligarchs, the rise of gangster capitalism. So where did the oligarchs come from? They came from a variety of places, just to mention some. One was the dynamics of the collapse itself. This is described in Karen DeWish's book, the first chapter of Karen DeWish's book, which I put on the syllabus. During the late 1980s, as things were getting more and more extreme in terms of the fiscal pressure on the Soviet government, various ministries, including the KGB, started shifting a lot of money offshore and putting it hard currency in bank accounts in Western banks. And some of the motivation for this was from loyalists, actually. They thought Soviet Union's going to collapse. We want to be able to live to fight another day. They sort of saw themselves as like, you know, the latter-day version of the French resistance, if you like, and they're going to need resources. And so, but others maybe have had different motives. But what happened in the August 1991 coup attempt was that the Soviet bureaucracy disappeared. And suddenly there were all kinds of people who found themselves with the control over these bank accounts, and they were now completely unsupervised. And so one relatively small but not inconsequential source of money from former Soviet officials was the money in these offshore bank accounts. And some people decided to make off with it, and that money resurfaced later at later times. But by far the bigger source of oligarchs was essentially the theft of state assets. And so here, for example, a gentleman by the name of Rem Vyakarev, who had also been a Soviet apparatchik, he'd been the deputy minister for oil and gas in the last years of the Soviet Union. He was put in charge of Gazprom, which is a large state venture controlling gas in the Soviet Union. But what did he do with this power that he had? He essentially started giving away large amounts of its assets to friends and relatives through various schemes. So they would essentially let friends and relatives buy gas at below market prices and then sell it and pocket the difference. And they even did this with large numbers of gas fields. And so we started to see the emergence of people making huge amounts of money from these dirty transactions. And essentially the looting of state assets by people who were put in charge of them. So somebody like Vyakarev was able to do this because he was strategically placed in order to be able to facilitate it. But a third, if you like, source of oligarchical power was derived from the fact that Russia had inherited a weak and bankrupt state. And I want to say a little bit about what I mean by a weak and bankrupt state. So much of the 1990s had been a period of fiscal crisis for the old Soviet Union. There had been massive debt racked up by the government. They were heavily dependent on oil revenues, which I'll talk more about in a little while. And when the price of oil gyrated, they would suddenly lose massive amounts of income. And this had all come to a head in 1998 when the Soviet Union, when Russia by then defaulted on its debt and had to be bailed out by the IMF. And so throughout the 1990s, the Russian government was fiscally strapped. And so what happened was that people took advantage of this fact. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who would later become famous for his ownership of Yukos, the private oil company, which I'll also have a little bit more to say about, he started a bank, Menatep Bank. And what he basically did was he speculated against the ruble. He would get the government to deposit large numbers of rubles in his bank. He would then he would exchange them into hard currency, and you'd have a commitment from the government not to demand them back for 4 months or 6 months or 8 months. And so essentially could speculate against the ruble, making large amounts of money. And he would pay it back later in less valuable funds. So there were people doing that kind of thing. And then there was the so-called loans for shares scheme, which is how he got control of Yukos. And this was in the mid-1990s, once the sort of bloom was off the rose of the revolution and people were starting to get angry. Things weren't improving fast enough. Population was hungry. And it didn't look good for Yeltsin's re-election. There was looming elections in 1996. And there had been something of a communist resurgence. They did extremely well in the 1995 legislative elections. And so the oligarchs who had started to emerge and get control of these various assets realized that for them it would be a disaster if the communists came back into power. And so they decided to get massively behind Yeltsin. And they did two things. One was the so-called loans for shares, where they essentially lent the government money in return for shares in state companies. And Khodorkovsky did this with respect to oil. And of course, later on, the government couldn't repay the loans, and so they would get to keep the shares. And so this was another way in which a lot of these state assets were looted. But then they also just poured money into Yeltsin's re-election campaign in 1996, and he was handily re-elected against the communist candidate in the second round. So basically, the oligarchs managed to emerge by taking advantage of the fact that the former Soviet Union was broke, and Russia in particular was broke for the vast majority of the 1990s. Then at the end of the 1990s, as I said, by then even the Communist Party had sort of gotten religion about capitalism. Yeltsin had reappointed many former communists to his government, but they got behind the reforms anyway, and so we saw that capitalism was not going away in Russia anytime soon, even though the country was staggering from debt crisis to debt crisis pretty much for the bulk of that decade. In comes Putin, and now we start to see a very different politics and economics emerging. And so what I want to do now is focus on how Yeltsin and how Yeltsin's oligarchs, if you like, were rather different from what was coming down the pike. So what I've said so far is that the Soviet Union at the end of its years, and certainly Russia in its first decade as a sovereign country, had a very weak state. The party had been strong and the state had been weak in the Soviet Union, but the party had essentially disintegrated. But I haven't defined my terms. So I probably should have done this earlier, but what do we mean when we talk about a state being a weak state? What makes a state weak? Yeah, you have to yell. Lack of the rule of law. That would be one symptom, certainly, of a weak state. What else would be a symptom of, yeah? You got to yell. That would be another sign. Any other signs of a weak state? Yeah. Somebody, yeah. So one sign, yeah, of a weak state is that it's an inability to tax, a low capacity to raise revenue. And the Russia that Putin inherited had a very, very bad tax system, very low enforcement. So for example, in the oil industry, which is the most important industry in the Soviet Union, they taxed output and exports, not profits, because they didn't have the auditing capacity to see whether people, profits are revenue minus costs, and they didn't have the capacity to audit, to stop companies from hiding profits. And so they would tax in a very inefficient way because that creates very bad incentives as well to innovate. So they didn't have the capacity to raise revenue very well. And indeed, throughout the 1990s, the oligarchs, led by Khodorkovsky, by the way, had waged war on efforts by the Russian government to improve the capacity to tax, that they had constantly lobbied for and been successful in getting the parliament not to improve the capacity to tax. And when Yeltsin came into power in January of 2000, his first speech was mostly about taxation. He said that he was determined to reform the finances of the Soviet Union, and he was going to completely reform the tax system, which he did. They had a very complex multi-tiered system with huge deductions. He brought in a 13% flat tax, kept taxes low across the board with no exceptions, and he's greatly simplified corporate taxation as well. So one of his big missions was to put Russia's fiscal house in order. And indeed, he partly got lucky because the price of oil went up, but they used a lot of that money. They created a sovereign wealth fund for a rainy day, knowing about the volatility of oil prices. And indeed, when the financial crisis finally hit later in the decade, Russia was pretty well placed to weather that storm. So that's one thing that Putin did in the first decade of this century. Just try, and people thought at the time that he was strengthening the Russian state. But the other side of a weak state is a haphazard use of power. And by this, I'm referring to the idea that when a government's capacity to enforce things is low, it has to compensate by being unpredictable. So for example, in a famous article about 18th century England, there were no police in 18th century England. They didn't get police until the 19th century, 1834, I believe, 1832, somewhere around there. But if you look at over the course of the 18th century in England, the number of capital offenses went up massively. You could be hanged for being a pickpocket. But the number of executions remained constant. They didn't actually execute more people. So basically what would happen, is that the assizes would come into town, they would string up a few people, and then they go off to the next parish, because that was the only capacity that they had. So there's a kind of trade-off. But one symptom of a weak state is the haphazard and often dramatic use of power in this way. And anyone who's read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the opening pages of the gory execution of somebody on the scaffold is again an illustration not of a strong state, but of a weak state. Again, when you see the Egyptian government sentencing hundreds of people to death on one day, almost none of whom end up being executed, it's a sign of a weak state, not a strong state. So haphazard use of power. And you look at Putin's early moves, and they underscore this. The most important thing he did was he took down Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky by then was the most wealthy Russian oligarch, owner of Yukos, and Putin threw him in prison. And he was charged with various forms of fraud, and eventually, when he'd already been in prison for about a year, he was finally sentenced to 9 years of imprisonment. And this got the attention of many of the other oligarchs. Nobody thought that Putin would have the temerity or the capacity to do this, but because of his KGB background, he had been a KGB officer in East Germany before he came back to the new Russia, he was able to do that. And then not only did he throw Khodorkovsky in prison, he basically seized back through a complex transaction, which I'm not going to describe, much of Yukos, and claimed it for Rosneft, the state oil company. And then he took down Vyakarev, who, as I said to you earlier, he had essentially been giving away gas fields and profits and so on. William Browder, about whom I'm about to tell you a little bit more, had exposed this. William Browder was the head of the Hermitage hedge fund, and he had done a lot of research on the way in which these gas fields were being given away and published them in the New York Times and elsewhere, and Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and so on. And everybody thought, this guy is crazy. He's going to get himself killed. But Putin responded instead by firing his chief of Gazprom, and again, reclaiming many of the assets that had essentially been given away at bargain basement prices. So Browder's worth pausing to think about for a minute. He was actually the grandson of Earl Browder, who had run as the communist representative against FDR for the US presidency in 1940. But he didn't get along with his family traditions. His parents had also been very much on the political left, and he didn't get along with his parents, and he thought, how can I annoy them the most? And the way I can annoy them the most is by becoming a capitalist. And so he had gone to Stanford Business School and worked for Boston Consulting Group and got himself to be in on the ground floor for the first Polish privatizations in 1989 and 1990, and then he had gone to Russia. And he became involved essentially he built up the biggest, at that time, by far the biggest hedge fund in the Soviet Union. It soon became worth well over $1 billion. And the way he did it was by taking on Russian corruption in firms. So the first company he bought an oil company, and he had some shares in this company. And the management of the company decided to respond to this by diluting his shares. Essentially, they were going to offer a whole block of new shares, but not allow him to buy any. So effectively diluting the value of his shares. And he filed a shareholders lawsuit. Again, people said, you're crazy, you're going to be killed. And he prevailed. And the share dilution scheme was stopped. And again, when he went after Gazprom and exposed what they were doing, he was convinced that he had figured out what he could do and that he was immune because he was a foreigner. He's a famous person today for reasons that will be obvious from this video clip.
Joining us first on CNBC to react to the man in question, Bill Browder, Hermitage Capital Management. Bill, good to have you here. I bet you're not surprised to hear Vladimir Putin refer to you directly.
It's not the first time, and it won't be the last time. Vladimir Putin is very mad at me. He's mad at me because of the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation named after my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. He was murdered after uncovering a $230 million Russian corruption scandal. Some of that $230 million went to Vladimir Putin himself. And so Putin feels personally exposed and potentially at risk of having his assets seized in the West. And so every chance he gets, he tries to get foreign countries to come after me. This is just one of many of his attempts.
He leveled an accusation at you that you funneled and helped funnel lots of money to Hillary Clinton, did you?
I did not. I did not. I'm not a U.S. citizen. I don't live in the United States. I've been living in Britain for 29 years. I make no campaign contributions. And so that's not true. I should also point out that Vladimir Putin and his regime have accused me of serial killing, of being a CIA, MI6 agent, and about 1,000 other things. And so they just he's kind of unhinged in these accusations.
You said before, Bill, that this is not the first time that President Putin has mentioned you, has called you out. What is your reaction in terms of your personal security after such a news conference? Do you increase it? Do you look behind you when you're walking down the street a little bit more often?
Well, my personal security has been at risk for a very long time. This is not this struggle that I'm having with Putin has been going on for 10 years. I mean, just a month ago, on May 30th in Madrid, I was arrested on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant by the Spanish police. Thankfully, Interpol contacted them 2 hours after I was arrested and made sure I was released. But the Russians have been coming after me for a long time, and so I'm not surprised. It doesn't change anything. I'm always on high alert. And there's a lot of people around the world, governments, people who are looking after me.
So what had happened with Browder was that he believed in his early years of the Putin regime, he believed that it was all due to his own acumen as an investor and his status as at that time he was a U.S. citizen, that he was able to go after these oligarchs. What he didn't understand, and that he learned later, was that he was pushing against an open door because he was going after Yeltsin's oligarchs, which Putin also wanted to get rid of. But once he started going after Putin's oligarchs, he ran into a brick wall. His accountant and lawyer, Maglinsky, was killed by the Russian police in a horrific scheme that's described at great length in his book, Red Notice. And he then went on this crusade to get the Maglinsky Act passed, which enables the U.S. government to seize the assets of oligarchs who are involved in illegal activities, and which was used after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And that's what the famous 2016 Trump Tower meeting was about, that the Putin regime was trying to get Trump to promise that they would repeal the Maglinsky Act. And so that saga is ongoing. So Russia, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. You can see here, it's up there with countries like Nigeria. This is one standard measure of corruption from Transparency International. You can see this is subjective perceptions of corruption in Russia, that people think, the vast majority of people think the vast majority of the Russian state is highly corrupt. And one question is, well, why is it so corrupt? One obvious answer is a kind of path-dependent story that we've talked about, that the fact that all these assets could be seized by former Soviet bureaucrats on the way out, or could be extracted from this very weak state, particularly in the 1990s, is a big part of the story. Secondly, there's this notion of a resource curse, which is often called the oil curse. And here, this is the political economist story. Now, the Russian economy, at first glance, doesn't look like it's so completely dominated by the oil sector. You can see here, it's at least half of the Russian economy is services. But if you start to look a little bit more closely, you see that while there are many different sectors in the Russian economy, one way or another, the vast majority of them are connected to the hydrocarbon industry, 3/4 of the Russian economy. So it's very oil dependent. You can see, and this is even more important, that the government's revenue is massively dependent on oil. So the only countries that are more oil dependent for government revenue are places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela. The Economist magazine in 2016 estimated that 40% of the Russian government's revenue is from oil. And this, of course, makes for a lot of corruption, because if the only way to get rich in Russia is to have access to the oil sector, then people who control that access can extract huge premiums for letting you participate. This is what makes Russian finances so dependent on the price of oil. And as you can, this is just another picture, which I will post these and you can peruse them at your leisure, but you can see that if oil prices fall, government revenues also fall with them. Which raises the question, why don't they diversify their economy? Why wouldn't they diversify the economy if it makes they're so hostage to the price of oil? Quick suggestion, anybody? Why don't they?
They can't.
Pardon?
They can't. They don't have the ability to move like that.
Why don't they?
Because their structure is just so complete.
So the beneficiaries, I would use beneficiaries where you use structure. The beneficiaries like it this way. They're making huge amounts of money out of it, right? The government needs it because it's very difficult for them to raise money in any other way. As I've said, the capacity, the institutional capacity of the Russian state to raise money in other ways is very constrained. But also, from the point of view of the government, it's the source of geopolitical power. If you think about where does all this oil go, think about Western Europe. You can see here that 3 of the biggest companies selling oil to Western Europe are Russian companies. And if you look at where European countries get their oil, just look at Germany. It's the top importer of Russian crude oil in the world. And this is why the Russian invasion of Ukraine played out the way it did, because not only oil, you can see here, Germany is the biggest consumer of Russian natural gas in the world. So if you think about Russia going into NATO and the NATO alliance, which we're going to be talking about on Tuesday, putting together and speaking with one voice about responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not going to be something that's high on Angela Merkel's agenda. She needs Russian oil and gas. She can't afford to antagonize the Russian regime. And so it was not surprising that the response to NATO was a lot of hand-wringing and strong statements, but nothing more than that. So it's because it's a source of geopolitical power for a weak state that it's very desirable from the point of view of Putin to retain this powerful sector. Okay, we will see you next week. Talking about the international architecture of what I'm calling the early post-Cold War world. And by early, I'm really focusing on the time from the collapse of communism until the financial crisis of 2008, because we're going to see that ushered in pretty big structural changes in both in the within a lot of the countries we're going to be talking about and in international political economy and in international relations. Our agenda, we're going to talk about NATO expansion after the Cold War. We're going to talk about the Washington Consensus, and then we're going to talk about the European Union, its enlargement and its challenges. So it's a pretty big menu. I do want to take a minute to say something about 3 lenses for thinking about politics. One of the problems with political science is that people tend not to say in words of 1 syllable what they can say in words of 5 syllables. And so there's an awful lot of terminology and jargon. And it's my ambition to use as little of this as possible. But I do want to alert you to 3 different ways of thinking about politics that to some extent compete and to some extent are complementary. The first is one that focuses on people's interests. You might think of Marxism as focusing on people's economic interests, but also formal rational choice models of politics that use economic approaches to politics focus on people's individual interests. It's all interest-based. And we think about just common folk wisdom about politics. People expect people to do things that are in their interest. When we move into the realm of international relations, this interest-based way of looking at the world sometimes traffics under the title of realism. That the realists in international relations are people who say that countries follow their individual interests. Now, not every interest-based theory of international politics is realist, because there are some who say, well, yeah, but you've got to look at the domestic politics of countries and how that influences what they do internationally. So they might still be interest-based, but they're not going to take countries as their basic unit of analysis. But the idea behind realism, behind all of these different schools I've just mentioned, is that if you want to understand what's going to happen in politics, look at the interests of the relevant actors. Might have different theories about that, but so on, interest-based. The second basic lens that people bring to bear on politics is about institutions. And here in domestic politics, it might be people who think independent courts and a separation of powers are important, that they structure what happens. Others think, no, it's the kinds of political parties, but institutional arrangements are important. When we think about the international system, so institutionalists travel under various labels again. They call them liberal institutionalists, some of them, but sometimes they just call themselves institutionalists, plain and simple. But they look at international institutions, things like the United Nations. NATO is a kind of institution. It's an alliance. It's not an international institution. It's an alliance, but it has an institutional presence. So the second lens focuses on institutional arrangements, which may or may not be consistent with the way people's interests line up, right? So, for instance, George Kennan, who I mentioned to you last time, thought the United Nations was a waste of time because countries always behave in their interests, and if the UN told them to do something that wasn't in their interest, they would ignore it. So that there you can see possible tensions between institutionalist and interest-based accounts. Rosa Luxemburg is famous for saying the rivers of history run through the most finely meshed statute. So again, it's a Marxist view that interests are going to prevail and institutional stuff is irrelevant. And then the third I'm putting under the heading of ideals, and this can be ideas, culture, norms, things other than interests and institutions that affect what actually happens in politics. And again, people disagree a lot about. Some hard-boiled realists will say norms and institutions are all beside the point. Others think norms are very important and that they actually structure what happens. Again, here there's lots of fancy terminology to capture this notion. There's something called constructivism in international relations theory. It's basically a theory of normative behavior, norms shaping outcomes. And so a lot of the squabbling in the academic journals and so on is among people who focus on interests, on institutions, or on ideas. And my own view, just putting my cards on the table before we dig into today, is that to say which is the right one is the wrong question, and it's better to try and understand what are the conditions under which interests tend to prevail, or institutions tend to prevail, or norms can restructure things. And those conditions change, and there's often much more play, there's sometimes much more play for norms, say, than at other times, like when the Cold War collapses and the institutional architecture is up for grabs. Then it might matter a lot what ideas are out there or not out there. But in the middle of the Cold War, when everybody's locked into positions that are highly rigid, then ideas are probably largely going to be beside the point. So that's the way I will tend to use these notions, and you will see them coming up obviously today, but throughout the course. Okay, so let's think about the first post-Cold War international security crisis, which was prompted by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in late 1990.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. This military action, taken in accord with United Nations resolutions and with the consent of the United States Congress, follows months of constant and virtually endless diplomatic activity on the part of the United Nations, the United States, and many, many other countries. Arab leaders sought what became known as an Arab solution, only to conclude that Saddam Hussein was unwilling to leave Kuwait. Others traveled to Baghdad in a variety of efforts to restore peace and justice. Our Secretary of State, James Baker, held an historic meeting in Geneva, only to be totally rebuffed. This past weekend, in a last-ditch effort, the Secretary General of the United Nations went to the Middle East with peace in his heart, his second such mission, and he came back from Baghdad with no progress at all in getting Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. Now, the 28 countries with forces in the Gulf area have exhausted all reasonable efforts to reach a peaceful resolution, have no choice but to drive Saddam from Kuwait by force. We will not fail. As I report to you, air attacks are underway against military targets in Iraq. We are determined to knock out Saddam Hussein's nuclear bomb potential. We will also destroy his chemical weapons facilities. Our objectives are clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. The legitimate government of Kuwait will be restored to its rightful place, and Kuwait will once again be free. Iraq will eventually comply with all relevant United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations. I had hoped that when the United States Congress, in historic debate, took its resolute action, Saddam would realize he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accord with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Instead, he remained intransigent, certain that time was on his side. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the will of the United Nations, leave Kuwait or be driven out. Saddam has arrogantly rejected all warnings. Instead, he tried to make this a dispute between Iraq and the United States of America. Well, he failed. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Regrettably, we now believe that only force will make him leave.
So that was the first Gulf War, so-called Operation Desert Storm. As President Bush said there, it was authorized. This is Resolution 678, which I will post and you can peruse at your leisure. I do want to notice that, it was authorized by the Security Council with Cuba and Yemen voting against. They were temporary members of the Security Council. The way the Security Council works is any one of the 5 permanent members can veto it, and China chose to abstain, but it didn't veto it, and Soviet Union supported it. So I start with this because I want to point out several things about what Bush did. He certainly was, the U.S. was certainly not blameless in this whole affair, and I don't want to sugarcoat every aspect of what President Bush did in this regard. He was heavily criticized later for having apparently signaled to Saddam Hussein that it would be okay with the U.S. if they went into Kuwait. He was also criticized for encouraging a Shiite uprising in southern Kuwait and then not supporting it after we left. So there are grounds for criticizing what we did, but the things I want to point out is, first of all, it was an action of last resort. Every effort, as he said in the video, had been made to end this without an invasion. Secondly, it was proportional. Stop the bully without becoming one. Bush took a lot of criticism for this. People said, you should go to Baghdad. You should knock off this regime. And he steadfastly refused to do it, partly because of the fact that he was not behaving unilaterally. As he indicated, there was a genuine coalition, including every Arab country except Jordan, was actually participating in this. And he knew that if he did more than the UN mandate, the Security Council resolution mandated, the coalition would collapse. So it was a broad-based coalition with strong regional support to stop the bully without becoming a bully. That is to say, this aggression will not be tolerated. And this, as I said, was the first international security crisis of the post-Cold War world. And had that become the template going forward, we would be in a very different place today. Well, that's one of the things I'm going to be arguing to you later in the course, because as it turns out, it was one of the paths not taken to treat the way in which Saddam Hussein had been expelled from Kuwait as perhaps norm setting for the future handling of international security crises. It was a path not taken. Okay, let's talk about NATO. What, when, and why? So NATO is a creature of the Cold War, and I've already mentioned the United Nations several times today, and it's important to think about NATO and the origins of NATO alongside the creation of the United Nations, because they were created both in the 1940s. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson had wanted to create a League of Nations, and that had failed largely because the American Congress wouldn't go along with it. And FDR had, during World War II, greatly invested in the idea that there must be an institution of this general sort created after World War II to prevent nations from going to war. And when President Truman came into office, he made it his business to make sure that that happened. And so here you can see President Truman addressing the conference in San Francisco in April of 1945 as they were drawing up the Charter of the UN.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die. Well, there's a time for making plans, and there's a time for action. The time for action is here now.
And indeed, they did act. They did create the institutions. And just to elaborate what he said later on in that speech, he said, the essence of our problem here is to provide sensible machinery for the settlement of disputes among nations. Without this, peace cannot exist. We can no longer permit any nation or group of nations to attempt to settle their arguments with bombs and bayonets. So he was foursquare behind the creation, as the U.S. was, unlike after World War I, the creation of the United Nations. But time moves on, and 4 years later, we were looking at a very, very different reality.
For us, war is not inevitable. We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep men one way or another. In our own time, we've seen brave men overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose. The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow. If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
So there was the creation of NATO, an alliance to face down what was seen as the Soviet threat. The previous month, just after the text of the proposed treaty had been released to the public, Secretary of State Dean Acheson went on radio, and I was going to play his radio speech for you, but the sound was too bad. But here you can see him saying that the best deterrent to aggression is the certainty that immediate and effective countermeasures will be taken against those who violate the peace. And then probably the most quoted line he ever uttered was that if the free nations do not stand together, they will fall one by one. So here the U.S. had moved from backing an international institution for solving conflicts to forming an alliance. And just what was this alliance? The most famous part of the NATO Charter is Article 5, which says that the parties agree that an armed attack on one of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them, and consequently, that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in the exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the UN Charter, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. And any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council, and, this is an important kicker, such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. So here is an alliance created that says an attack on one is an attack on all. We are entitled to protect any member of that alliance as though we had been attacked. We will report it to the Security Council, but we will not cease and desist until the Security Council has taken the measures necessary, essentially, to eliminate the threat. So not only had the U.S. created this new alliance, but had clearly said that the UN, a realist might say this is exactly what you should expect, a realist would say that the UN is subordinate to the interests of NATO. Now it tells you how hard-boiled a realist Kennan was, that he was also against NATO for two reasons. One is that he thought it would unnecessarily militarize the standoff with the Soviets. They would create a similar alliance, which they indeed did a few years later. That's where the Warsaw Pact came from. It was the Soviet response to NATO. But he also said it's stupid because when the chips are down, countries follow their own interests. They're no more going to be guided by membership of an alliance than they are going to be guided by UN resolutions. Nonetheless, the U.S. created NATO. And the first thing to say about NATO is it's a historically unprecedented, highly unusual alliance. If you think about George Washington's farewell address to Congress in 1796, he said, and this was seen as a warning for the future, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." If you Google up things like international encumbrances, you can find American president after American presidents saying we will not commit ourselves to any encumbrance on a long-term or permanent basis. And they all echo this philosophy that was once attributed to Lord Palmerston from a famous speech he made in the House of Commons in 1846 when he said, "We have no eternal allies, we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests," another hard-boiled realist, "are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." So American presidents had been guided, American administrations had never formed any kind of permanent alliance that essentially followed the Palmerston-Washington view. And here we have the creation of an alliance among the Western powers dedicated to protecting one another in perpetuity, with armed force if necessary and subordinating international institutions to that purpose. Now, a lot of debate about whether NATO was successful during the Cold War. You could say, well, U.S. won the Cold War, and some people say, you could say that we wouldn't have won it without NATO. That's one of the, we can't run the counterfactual, so it really is something of an imponderable, whether we could have won the Cold War without NATO. It is also worth noticing that NATO, during the Cold War, never actually went into battle. The first time a NATO operation occurred, which I'm going to talk more about later in the course, was in Kosovo in 1999, after the Cold War over, and by the way, when Article 5 was not triggered because no NATO country was threatened. And that same thing is true with subsequent NATO actions in the post-Cold War period, such as the invasion of Libya in 2012, about which we'll also be spending time later. The partial exception was 9/11, although even then NATO, the U.S. essentially went to war more or less immediately after the attacks, and NATO allies participated, but NATO didn't assume full operational control in Afghanistan until several years later. So NATO after the Cold War. Some people, such as French President Francois Mitterrand, said, well, it's done its job, we should get rid of it. It was there to protect these countries against the Soviet Union, and it's now an alliance without a purpose. That was a difficult thing to do right at the end of the Cold War because of East Germany. And the thing about East Germany was it rapidly became clear after the wall came down that Germany was going to be reunited, and it was an unstoppable force to reunite Germany. And reuniting Germany made a lot of people nervous. There were many people remembered World War II, and some, not that few, also remembered World War I, and the idea of an independent Germany outside of NATO made a lot of Europeans nervous. And so the impetus to say the reunified Germany would be part of NATO came from the other European powers. And the Russians didn't like it. they too said, you know, what's going on here? Why is NATO starting to expand? And George Herbert Walker Bush and Helmut Kohl, who was then the German Chancellor, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand beyond, including Germany, and that had been an artifact of the reunification. Gorbachev was less than impressed by their reasoning.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences. So my question is this a new strategy? I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve. Glasnost, free elections, political pluralism, the problems of concern to you.
So he was skeptical. He thought that this is not likely to be how things are going to play out. But he saw this, as he says in that clip, he saw this as a humiliation of Russia. It was still the Soviet Union at that time. He saw this as a humiliation of the Soviet Union and was adamantly opposed to it. But history played out differently. So let me just give you a sense of what was coming now.
Today we welcome Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, finally erasing the boundary line the Cold War artificially imposed on the continent of Europe, strengthening an alliance that now, clearly, is better preserved to keep the peace and preserve our security into the 21st century. For the 16 of us already in NATO, enlarging our alliance, our goal is to help to build a Europe that is undivided, free, democratic, at peace, and secure.
So there you have it, the first 3 East European countries included in NATO in 1999, and that, as you can see, is the first edition of countries besides Germany's not on this list since the end of the Cold War. So this didn't go down very well in Russia, as Gorbachev had predicted. It produced a sense of outrage and humiliation. So here again, just to give you a little flavor of it.
Самое главное, чтобы натовцы поняли, что есть поколение, которое исправит ошибки сегодняшних политиков. Это поколение вот стоит.
So a couple of comments about that clip. So one is on the signs. One of the things that they're demonstrating about is that President Clinton had bombed Iraq for violating the no-fly zones, and there's basically only an idiot or worse would be bombing Iraq, the no-fly zones that had been set up following Saddam Hussein's invasion from Kuwait. This gentleman at the end of the clip is somebody by the name of Sergei Baburin. He was a Soviet-Russian politician and subsequently became one of the leaders of a far-right populist movement. And what he's saying at the end of that clip is he's basically saying, we made a mistake once, but the next generation are not going to be making the same mistakes. And it's interesting that he said this in response to them demonstrating against the American bombing of Iraq, partly because, as I noticed in 1991 when I was in Moscow, and I told you about in an earlier lecture, the U.S. Desert Storm operation was hugely popular among Russians in 1991. In 1991, the U.S. could do no wrong. In fact, in Moscow in 1991, in March of 1991, there were actually commercials for selling Desert Storm condoms. Go figure. I never quite could understand what it was trying to communicate, but there had been no resistance to the idea that Bush Sr. had gone in. But 7 years later, when these East European countries were starting to join NATO, things played out very differently, and it didn't stop there. It continued.
低溫萬歲，全新 chocolate， 醇香細膩 ，Nescafe Cold Brew。
Thank you all. Welcome. Thank you all. Thank you all. Good afternoon and welcome to the White House. Today we proudly welcome Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. We welcome them into the ranks of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. When NATO was founded, the people of these 7 nations
were captives to an empire. They endured bitter tyranny. They struggled for independence. They earned their freedom through courage and perseverance. And today they stand with us as full and equal partners in this great alliance. This is a special moment in the hopeful story of human liberty, as America formally declares its support for Albania and Croatia's entry into NATO. We strengthen America's partnership with nations that once found themselves in the shackles of communism. We rejoice in taking a major step toward welcoming the people of Albania and Croatia into the greatest alliance for freedom the world has ever known.
And I want to reaffirm as strongly as I can the United States' commitment to honor Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. No ally or adversary should ever question our determination on this point. It is the bedrock of the alliance and an obligation that time will not erode. The NATO membership process, which requires applicants to make reforms across their political, economic, and defense sectors, has helped create the stable democratic Europe we see today. We were glad to see the alliance welcome Albania and Croatia last year, and there can be no question that NATO will continue to keep its door open to new members.
Montenegro's accession is good for Montenegro, it's good for NATO, it's good for the stability of the Western Balkans, and it's good for international peace and security. Today is a historic day, so President Vujanovic, welcome so much to NATO. It's a great honor to have you here. Welcome.
With NATO membership, our future will be stable, secure and prosperous, and we will make decisions about the most important issues within the strongest, the most organized and most efficient alliance in the history of mankind.
So, as you can see, this has been a bipartisan story on the U.S. side. Democrats and Republicans alike have led the expansion of NATO to include all of the former members of the Warsaw Pact except for Russia. And this actually doesn't tell the whole story, because there were others who wanted to join NATO as well. So in 2008, for example, NATO announced that it would welcome the addition of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. And that is part of what prompted the Russian incursion into Georgia in 2008, and also had a big impact in Ukrainian politics that contributed to the way things would play out in 2014. A couple of other things to notice about this accession. You might wonder why in 2004 we added all of these countries to NATO. Why do you think? Anyone have a thought? Why would the Bush administration, many East European countries wanted to join NATO from very early on, but there had been resistance. I mean, after all, you're committing yourself to go to war if one of these countries is attacked. That's not a light thing, right? It's not like saying, well, let them join the European Union. If they don't like it, we'll kick them out, or they can leave. This is really committing you to defend these countries. Why would the U.S., anyone, pardon? It was related to what he was doing in the Middle East, but it was not deflection. What were we doing? What had we just done in the Middle East in 2004? Yeah.
We had just invaded Iraq, and then the former current allies were not supportive.
Bingo. Exactly right. So what had happened was, after, this is something we will return to later in the course, but once the Bush Jr., George W. Bush, had decided to invade Iraq in 2003, unlike what his father had done, he couldn't get a Security Council resolution to authorize it, and he had a lot of trouble putting together a coalition, because all the Middle Eastern countries were not in favor of it, and he needed the fig leaf of an international coalition to create, he thought, legitimacy for this action. And so if you look at all of these countries except Slovenia, every one of these countries joined the coalition, nominally at least, and sent troops to Iraq as part of the U.S.-led coalition of the willing. They joined the coalition of the willing, and the quid for the quo was that he supported their accession to NATO the following year. Interestingly, though, they all got rid of the draft in the meantime. Clearly, they were worried about the domestic politics of committing their youth to fighting in wars to defend NATO countries. So here you see that geopolitics playing itself out in this way, that this is very much an interest-based story, that Bush is looking to get legitimation for his invasion, and so that became the impetus for getting these countries to join. It's also, one might think it's something of an anomaly, given the Trump administration's hostility to NATO in general, why they allowed the Montenegro thing to go forward. Of course, it had been started much earlier, but I think as far as Trump is concerned, it doesn't really matter who's in NATO. Nonetheless, the question that Trump asks about NATO is not a crazy question, right? And it's the same question Francois Mitterrand was asking. What is this alliance there actually for? So there's some enduring questions about post-Cold War NATO, which are going to come back later in the course. One is, was Mitterrand right? Was there a missed opportunity at the end of the Cold War? Was Gorbachev right? Did NATO expansion make it more likely that someone like Putin would come to power in Russia? Gorbachev had said, humiliate people and there will be consequences. And certainly the steady incursion of of NATO into the former, not only Eastern Europe, but as I said, they were running up trial balloons about incorporating the Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. There's a colorable case that this might have bolstered the nationalism of a figure like Putin. We'll come back to that too. And what are the advantages and costs of having a permanent military alliance that now lacks any clear motivating purpose? It's led by the most powerful military on earth. It's not clear what its goal is or is not. We will see later in the course that when it has become active, it has had nothing to do with Article 5 of the NATO treaty, but it's rather taken on new missions and new rationales, mostly ad hoc, dreamed up on the fly to suit the interests of different players at different times. Let's turn to the Washington Consensus, or what I'll say, taking neoliberalism global. And I'll talk somewhat briefly about this because I want to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the European Union. So the Washington Consensus, again, and what I call the Washington Consensus is essentially a global version of what often gets called neoliberalism. And I think of it, again, distilling it down and getting rid of all the jargon that plagues these discussions as having three main features. One is deregulation, the second is free trade or trade agreements, and the third is privatization of state assets, previously held state-held assets. Within countries, that tends to be called neoliberalism. When the World Bank or the IMF or the Americans try to get other countries, as they did particularly up until the financial crisis, when the Washington Consensus, we'll see, started to lose some of its ideological power in the world, that's what the core elements of the diet on which they would insist for countries to get U.S. aid or aid from institutions controlled by the World Bank or the IMF. And it's difficult to overstate the confidence, the hubris, we might say in retrospect, the confidence with which this was viewed as the one-size-fits-all approach to economic development. In 2004, in a speech to the New York Fed, I think it was the New York Fed, Ben Bernanke, who was then chairman of the Federal Reserve, made a speech that you can, if you Google up his Great Moderation so-called speech, it's a speech in which he says, essentially, the technocrats running the Fed are now sufficiently competent that well, he didn't actually say this, but this is what it's come to be interpreted as having said. What he actually said was somewhat more nuanced. But the takeaway lines from the speech are to the effect that the Fed has basically managed to, if not abolish the business cycle, manage it so successfully that the peaks and troughs could not be too damaging, and we can largely have no inflation, full employment, and let the technocrats run it. As I said, what he actually said, if you go and read the whole speech, was a little more nuanced than that. But it became emblematic of the idea that this diet of economic deregulation, free trade, and privatization, informing all public policy, was the way to go, and that the world would be hunky-dory thereafter. Deregulation of Wall Street after the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. So here, the Glass-Steagall Act had been enacted in the 1930s in the wake of the Depression to stop trading, just to stop investment banks from engaging in investments on their own accounts with depositors' money. You either have to be an investment bank or a commercial bank. The banks didn't like it. They lobbied against it for decades. And actually, by the time it was repealed in 1999, there wasn't much of it left. Read Ron Chernow's The House of Morgan if you want the blow-by-blow of the lobbying about that. Brilliant book, among his many brilliant books. And so there's great debate now about how much actually getting rid of Glass-Steagall contributed to the financial crisis. Some say not at all. Some say it was really all about real estate markets, had nothing to do with that, and some say a lot. But my point in mentioning it here is not whether repealing Glass-Steagall contributed to the financial crisis. I tend to think probably not. But it was emblematic of and ushered in a whole other set of steps of deregulation. So, for instance, in 2004, Hank Paulson, who was then chairman of Goldman Sachs, led a group of the 5 biggest banks to Washington to lobby Christopher Cox, who was then the head of the SEC, not the sharpest knife in Congress, to lobby him on the grounds that if a bank was sufficiently big, if it had $5 billion in assets, it should be exempted from capital requirements or have reduced capital requirements because they were big enough to self-insure. The thought that because they were so big is maybe why they should have the capital requirements didn't seem to occur to him. So that the ones that were too big to fail were the ones that were subjected to less in the way of capital requirements. And we might say, go figure, how could anyone be so foolish? The quid for the quo, by the way, they said, we'll open our books to you. But the SEC at that time had a tiny office with, I think it was 7 people working in it, ostensibly to keep track of $4 trillion worth of assets. So they weren't going to be able to do this in any serious way, monitor the books of these companies. And indeed, months before the financial crisis, literally 2 or 3 months before the financial crisis, Cox was reassuring Congress that the big banks were fundamentally sound, and then turned around and Lehman Brothers went, yeah. So, I'm not giving you a story about the causes of the financial crisis, but I'm giving you a story about the confidence people had in this deregulatory enterprise, that just leave it all to the Fed, get rid of all the regulations, and everything will be fine. And so this was the neoliberal game at home, and it was the Washington Consensus taken abroad. There was much more resistance to it in what we might think of as the global south. This is just one of endless numbers of cartoons one could put up, indicating that it was perceived as a kind of imperialist venture from the point of view of particularly developing countries that were having this diet imposed upon them. But in the second and first worlds, the hegemony of this idea was, it's hard to overstate. And I was talking about Russia last time. If you look at U.S. aid to Russia, it gives you some sense also, I think, as a kind of proxy for American influence over Russia. You can see that at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 92, 93, that you get huge amounts of U.S. assistance to Russia. And then it goes down, and then in 1998, when they default, this is when Russia defaulted on its debt. I talked about that last time. It gets bailed out by the IMF. You see it increase again. And then in the early 2000s, it goes down after the crisis wanes. And then here, and this is the period when Putin is basically implementing the Washington Consensus diet. This is when he's reforming the tax system. It's when he's bringing tax rates down to 13% flat rate, balancing the books, building up a massive sovereign wealth fund, a rainy day fund. And so he's essentially getting rewarded for following what many would have regarded as pretty orthodox Washington Consensus policies. And the best book about this is by a man by the name of Christopher Miller, which I put on the suggested reading list, called Putinomics. But then you can see, and this is for later in the course, what happens after the financial crisis. Not only does U.S. aid go south, but so does U.S. influence. And we'll talk more about that later. So let's talk about the European Union and its challenges. It's been around since early 1950s. The European Coal and Steel Community came into being as a byproduct of the Treaty of Paris, signed by the original six: France, Italy, the Netherlands, West Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg. It became the European Economic Community as a result of the Rome Treaty of 1957. A much more ambitious treaty was enacted in 1992, the so-called Maastricht Treaty, and the most recent piece of legal architecture, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, was the Lisbon Treaty of 2007. I'm not going to give you the blow-by-blow of how all the 28 countries, how they got from 6 to 28, but you can Google it up for yourself and see when the different ones joined. What I want us to do is focus more on what was the point of this. Why was a European Union thought to be necessary? What purpose would it serve? Yeah. To stave off war. So in the first, there were multiple motives, but it's good that you're clairvoyant and got the first item on my slide, because what if you had come up with a third item on my slide? I would have been crossed out. But you came up with the first item, so that's fantastic. So part of the impetus was particularly people were worried about France and Germany going to war again. Not only the French and the Germans. Churchill, for example, was a big fan of the European Coal and Steel Community, and he didn't want Britain to join, but he wanted the Europeans to join, partly for that reason. So that was a beginning, part of the initial impetus. This is for the political philosophers in the room. This is Montesquieu's idea of du commerce, that if you have commercial interchange with a country, it's going to be peace generating, right? So that was one. Other reasons why people might have favored the creation, yeah. To reduce the pressure from the Soviet Union and? Okay, so let's take the second. This was less about the Soviet Union and more about the U.S., because I want to keep you on my slide here. This was the big French motive. De Gaulle, for example, was a big proponent of the idea that what the Europeans needed to do was to band together to be a comparable force in the world to the U.S., right? Now, de Gaulle, I'm sure, as you all know, was a staunch nationalist, right? Staunch French nationalist. So he did not want a political union that could in any way erode French national sovereignty. He would be, I think, chuckling at the Brexit fight that's going on at the moment. But the way in which de Gaulle thought you could both have a strong united Europe and protect the national sovereignty of France, which they got it very jealously. They kicked NATO troops out of France. They want their own independent nuclear deterrent. They did not. They had a very jealous conception of their independence and sovereignty, and they were not going to be pushed around by the Americans. So they came up with the idea that any important changes in the Union would have to be resolved by unanimity rule. And of course, unanimity rule is a dictatorship of one, right? If you have unanimity rule, if you don't like the proposed change, you can stop it, you can block it. So de Gaulle was a strong proponent of unanimity rule, and so this was the idea of a big bloc that could be of comparable economic clout in the world to the U.S. Any other reasons why people might have thought it important to have a big economic union of countries, European countries? Trade. You guys are amazing. Wow. Okay. Yes. So, but here's the thing. It's complicated because and this is part of, again, Trump administration's beef about the EU, it's an internal free trade zone, but it's externally protectionist, right, in many respects. You go and talk to African farmers about the tariffs that they experience trying to sell their goods in Europe. So so in this sense, and this is one of the reasons Britain had such a difficult time before Britain finally joined under Edward Heath in the 1970s. They had been rejected twice because Britain wanted to preserve its imperial preference before they realized there was no empire left to prefer. But they had essentially had trading arrangements with members of the empire, and then when they created the Commonwealth, they wanted to have preferential treatment for trade from the Commonwealth, and the European Union said no, they couldn't have that. And so the French actually, de Gaulle was flatly against Britain joining the European Union and vetoed it, and they didn't join it until after he left power in 1969. So it was an internally free trade, but externally it was a protectionist trading bloc. And that, incidentally, we can fast forward, it's the story of TPP, what the Trump administration failed to understand, or at least to articulate, if they did understand it, was that the TPP was not just a free trade deal. It was about containing China from developing its influence in the Far East. And it was largely motivated actually by a political agenda because China, for reasons we're going to talk about later, had become much more muscular in the South China Sea and elsewhere during the course of the Obama administration. So the EU, we could say, is internal free trade zone, externally protectionist. But actually that's too simple, because the sense in which it was internally a free trade area is complicated, because I put up here was a first mover advantage. And so if you think back to what I just said about de Gaulle insisting on unanimity rule, that meant that the things you could put in place early on would be very difficult to change, because you would have a veto power. And so the French didn't agree to the British joining until they had put in the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policies. And particularly the common agricultural policy was massive protection for French farmers and was operated to the great disadvantage of British farmers. And so it was a free trade zone with a difference. And an interesting irony of history here is that when Britain joined the European Union in the 70s, the British parties were a polar opposite of what they are today about Europe. At that time, the Labour Party was badly divided over Europe, and the Conservatives were largely in favor of Europe, because Europe, the Tories thought, would be an instrument for disempowering British unions and deregulating the economy and making it function more efficiently. Margaret Thatcher, a lot of people don't know this. Margaret Thatcher was one of Ted Heath's most aggressive lieutenants in getting Britain into the European Union. She only became a Eurosceptic later. Not only that, later in about halfway through her administration, Margaret Thatcher was the person who pushed the European Union toward qualified majority voting on things like reducing non-tariff barriers to trade, because she could see before she did that, she had negotiated big rebates for Britain because of the unfairness of the common agricultural policy and so on. So Britain was getting rebates, but she wanted, in her privatizing agenda, which we're going to be concerned with in a couple of weeks from now, she wanted more what we call neoliberal policy. She wanted the reduction of non-tariff barriers to trade in Europe. It was completely obvious you couldn't get that with unanimity rule in the Union, because whoever stood to lose by getting rid of these barriers to trade would veto. So they went to qualified majority voting to make decisions in the European Union at the behest of Margaret Thatcher. So that's another reason that the European Union was created. There was this internal free trade zone, but with these wrinkles to it. A fourth reason, which is much less intuitively obvious, is that people saw this as a counterweight to some of the pressures of their own domestic politics. And I can give you a dramatic example of this that I ran into at a conference in Portugal about 3 years ago, when the rolling Euro crisis was going on and the southern European countries were in extremis. And a left-wing German intellectual, sort of neo-Marxist by the name of Klaus Offer, stood up, this was in Portugal, and he gave a speech in which he said, we Germans are really screwing you southern Europeans. You should insist on being let out of the euro, because we're just forcing, you should be able to devalue your currencies and re-equilibrate your economies to get yourselves out of this crisis, and you can't because of us nasty Germans. So he thought he would get huge applause. And this Portuguese politician, I don't speak Portuguese, she stood up and screamed at him. And evidently he understood enough Portuguese to get the sense that she was angry with him, but not what he was saying. So I said, I think you've misunderstood what I'm saying. And he said it again, and she screamed at him even more. So then we went for lunch, and I was with a bunch of economists and lawyers, and I said, what was that about? And the economists all said, well, the Portuguese government knows that but for these constraints, the Portuguese government would be printing money hand over fist and would have massive hyperinflation. And the lawyers all said, you don't seem to understand. Portugal has never been able to be a democracy outside of the European Union, right? So these people saw it actually, the fact that this was a constraint on Portugal was a good thing. And in a less dramatic fashion, even the Germans liked some of the constraints. And then finally, of course, there was the idea of a federal European European state. This is the idea most famously associated with Jacques Delors of an ever closer union. It actually comes from a declaration in Stuttgart, signed in 1983, including by the British, by the way. The heads of state or government, on the basis of an awareness of a common destiny and the wish to affirm the European identity, confirm their commitment to progress toward an ever closer union among the peoples and member states of the community. So, 5 motivations there. What do they all share in common? What's common? I mean, they're a disparate list, but there's one thing in common. Yeah. They focus on Europe. What's another thing in common? Power numbers. What's another thing? Okay. So they're all examples. They're all from above. They're an elite project. If you think about it, they are the views of what elites think should happen in Europe. And a symptom of that happens in 2005, when the Maastricht had created a constitution that was going to integrate Europe even more, much more ever closer union. And as you can see, France and the Netherlands held referendums in which it was voted down by the populations, the European constitution that had come out of Maastricht. And that quickly led the Czechs, the Danes, the Irish, the Polish, the Portuguese, and the UK governments all to cancel their referendums. And actually the Lisbon Treaty is a step back from Maastricht, because Maastricht was really trying to create a federal state, and the Lisbon Treaty steps back to making it an intergovernment arrangement. Very much a top-down enterprise. And so the implications of this are one, and this is the chapter and verse of this, is in Tony Judd's book, Post-War, which he published in 2005. He died shortly thereafter, so he had already finished it before these referendums. But the basic message of that book about Europe is, look out when the first crisis hits, because there's no grassroots support for this institution. And what happened when the first crisis did hit, we'll talk about later, but the chapter and verse of that is in Adam Tooze's book, Crashed, which is mainly a book about the Eurozone crisis and why the European governments have been unable to resolve it. And again, it's to do with the fact that this was an elite project, although he plays out the conflicts of interest within the elites. And then there's one final thing I will mention before we close, and to bring why have I've been talking about NATO and the European Union. So NATO is actually a source of the obstacle to a pan-European identity, because they contract out their national security. If you think back to the beginning of the U.S., we almost lost the War of Independence because the states wouldn't ante up soldiers and funds to fight the war. And the reason we created the federal constitution was to enable Washington to raise an army so that it could defend itself and pay its national debts. Because Europe contracts out essentially its national security to NATO, there's no European army. There's no sense that Europeans might have to go and die for Europe in the way that, as a result of the transition from the Confederation to the United States of America, we have created a national entity with which people actually identify. So there's an irony there that actually the strength of NATO can be an obstacle to the formation of a pan-European identity. Okay, we're out of time, and next we will be talking about fusing capitalist economics with communist politics in China and Vietnam.